The ink on the transfer looked dry, but the room smelled of it as if someone had just exhaled a lie. The notary's round seal caught the window light like a small moon, bright enough to make my eyes ache. I was 74 that morning, slower on the stairs but steady with paper, and the clerk at the county office slid the file toward me without ceremony. The manila folder was soft at the edges, touched by too many undecided fingers. Our surname on the first page sat there without warmth, the L a little too proud, the E trailing like a tail meant to distract. I had signed my name thousands of times across decades of deliveries and contracts, receipts stapled to carbon copies, pencils dull and sharpened again, the rhythm of work beating through years. The page in front of me wore a signature that imitated my patience but none of my fatigue. The business had always spoken in ledgers and freight slips, in the clatter of loading docks and the clank of an old brass elevator. New York humidity taught us to guard against mold and against hope. My brother understood those rules as well as I did, learned under the same ceiling fan that rattled in August, in the same cold warehouse mornings when our breath rose like the steam from the street grates. He had a lighter hand than mine, a way of smoothing disagreements until the other man nodded without realizing he had given away a week. I wanted to believe that hand would never smooth me away. The clerk waited. I asked for the preceding filings, polite, a man whose cane would be invisible if dignity were a kind of cloak. He brought another folder, and then another. Dates stacked like bricks. I read, the transfer of voting rights, the amendment to the partnership agreement, the consent recorded on a Tuesday I had spent at Bellevue visiting an old friend with a slow heart. The certified signature mirrored mine with the wrong hesitation at the N, a tiny stutter where my pen never faltered. Only then did I see that the embossed seal showed yesterday on a form dated 20 years ago. He had threaded new metal through old cloth, trusting that the fabric of our memory would stretch rather than tear. The thought hit with a calm so perfect it felt cruel. I remembered a night in '79 when our father dropped a ring of keys into a mason jar and said nothing. My brother had lifted them out, smiling with his eyes closed, and I had understood the difference between inheritance and custody. Paper, after all, is a door. Whoever holds the keys to the hinges chooses who may walk through. I traced the forged curve with a fingertip, the way a blind man might learn a scar, and felt more tired than angry. Across the room a wall clock declared each second with a wooden tick that belonged to older buildings and older rules. I asked for the notary ledger. The clerk's mouth tightened, but the book appeared, thick, cloth-bound, honest as a ledger can be. Inside, yesterday's date, sat beside a name I recognized, an assistant who had once brought us black coffee during a winter audit and refused a tip with the stiff pride of the underpaid. It was not sloppiness. It was choreography. The courthouse corridor was cooler than the office, long and polished, a lane for people who carried decisions like bundles under their arms. My reflection drifted along the marble, thin and exacting. I heard my brother's voice in an old memory, telling an impatient trucker, "Do it right, so you only do it once." And I imagined his careful breath steadying the forger's hand. A kindness in the service of theft is still theft. Outside, a delivery boy swerved past a puddle with the grace of someone taught to avoid splashes, and I understood this, too, was training. I folded the documents back into the folder, the way an undertaker smooths a sleeve. The plan arrived as if I'd always been walking toward it. The dull machinery of petitions and affidavits, the bench where a judge would look at ink the same way I had, without nostalgia. My brother had not stolen a moment. He had stolen a name, and the city kept records like a jealous god. I left the clerk with a thank you that meant nothing and everything, and the hallway seemed longer on the way out, as if time had chosen a side. On the steps, the August heat pressed its thumb against my chest, and the traffic muttered the way family mutters when it thinks no one hears. I squared the folder under my arm and turned uptown with a pace I hadn't used in years, because by then I knew the only doorway left was the one I would force open myself. and I knew whose hand I would pry from the knob. The words carried their own weight as I stepped into the shade of an elm-lined block, where even the sunlight seemed cautious. My grip on the folder tightened, not from fear, but from a kind of discipline that comes when rage has already been measured and stored for later use. I had not spoken to my brother in almost 6 months, not since the dinner at Delmonico's, where the wine had tasted faintly of vinegar, and his smile had been too deliberate. That night he had asked after my health, my sleep, the state of my knees, as if cataloging weaknesses. I remembered his fork pausing mid-air when I mentioned a new accountant reviewing the quarterly numbers, a stillness so brief most would have missed it. I had not missed it. The cab that carried me uptown rattled in rhythm with the plan forming in my head. Paper could be fought with paper, and the courts in this city loved nothing more than the slow grind of proof. I imagined him reading the first notice from my attorney, the polite, bloodless language of legal summons that carried all the weight of a trap shutting. Halfway to my apartment, I saw him in my mind's eye as he must have looked signing my name, calm, meticulous, a craftsman of betrayal. And yet that image wavered when I thought of the boy who once stood beside me in the rain outside Pier 17, sleeves soaked, guarding the shipment from a stranger's hand. Was this the same man, or had I mistaken loyalty for proximity all those years? When the cab stopped, the air felt heavier. The doorman glanced at the folder, then at me, as if sensing it was no ordinary bundle of papers. Inside my apartment, I laid the documents on the dining table, aligning each corner until they sat perfectly square. The city murmured beyond the window, a low, constant negotiation. That was when I realized the boy's smile never reached his eyes. The memory was not from childhood, but from a recent board meeting 2 years back, when a supplier had accused us of shorting a shipment. My brother had smiled at the man across the table, a slow curve of lips without warmth, and somehow convinced him to drop the claim. I had thought it skill, now I wondered if it had been rehearsal. I called an old contact in Queens, a man who had once testified against a corrupt customs officer and lived to tell of it. His voice was gravel and tobacco. He agreed to meet, though he warned me not to expect kindness from the process I was about to begin. "The law's not a sword, Johnny," he said. "It's a millstone. You just gotta make sure it grinds the right grain." That night, I could not sleep. The radiator hissed like a whisperer just beyond the door. I kept seeing the forged signature, the faint press of the nib into the paper, and wondered how many times he had practiced it before getting it right. There is something almost intimate about imitation. You must know the other man's hand better than your own. My brother had studied me like a locksmith studies a stubborn lock. By morning, the course was set. The papers would be copied, sealed, and placed in the hands of those who could turn ink into restitution. I buttoned my jacket with care, the way I used to before walking into a negotiation, where every word would be weighed like gold dust. It struck me then that family wars are quieter than the rest. The battles happen in rooms where the walls remember laughter, where betrayal walks in on familiar feet, and it struck me too that my brother might already know I was coming. I stepped out into the street, the sun sharper now, the pavement smelling faintly of iron. Somewhere uptown he was sipping coffee, perhaps reading the paper, perhaps already sensing the shift in the air. I would not arrive as a supplicant. I would arrive as the man who remembered everything he had ever been owed, and I knew he would see that in my eyes before I spoke a word. The thought steadied my steps as I cut across town toward the old warehouse, where dust kept better records than men. The rusted roll gate wore scratches like tally marks no one admitted making. Inside, the air had the cold of stone, even in August, a smell of rope, oil, and burlap that set the bones remembering. Pallets stood like patient animals. I passed the freight scale where, years ago, we measured not only weight but honesty, and a palm on its iron plate as if greeting an accomplice. Lou, the foreman who had come to us in the winter of '68 with cracked hands and a stubborn back, stepped from his glass cubicle, cap in hand. He stared at the folder under my arm before he looked at my face. "You here to take inventory, Mr. Lee?" he asked, voice low enough to hide in. "Only what's missing," I said, because riddles sometimes protect the listener more than the speaker. We walked the central aisle. Dust swam in slanted light, briefly golden before falling back into gray. I asked about the archive room, the cabinets where we locked the old partnership papers in drawer after labeled drawer. Lou hesitated, an old dog lifting his nose at a change in the weather, and then pointed with his cap toward the back. Halfway there, he stopped, and the quiet rearranged itself around us. That was when I realized Lou's eyes were measuring not distance, but consequences. "The cabinets went," he said at last, 4 months back. "Your brother said we were courting mold, said he rented a storage room across the river. Pest man came through. Sulfur smell for 2 days. I pretended not to hear the apology hidden in his posture. We reached the scar on the floor where the cabinets had stood. Cleaner wood, pale against the darker boards, like teeth knocked out and gums left bare. I crouched, touched the line of nail holes, and felt the old anger gather itself, careful and useful. He had the old red ledger boxed separately," Lou added, almost whispering. "Said it was delicate. I didn't think paper could be delicate." I looked up. "Why mention the red one?" "'Cause I kept it," he said, and there was fear in his honesty that made me like him more. Old superstition. First book stays where it started, or luck leaves by the same door it came in. He led me to his cubicle. From beneath the desk, he slid out a wrapped parcel the size of a loaf of bread, tied with twine the way grocers used to do. The cloth smelled faintly of camphor. He set it on the desk without ceremony and stepped back, as if placing it near me had completed a vow. I untied the twine. The ledger lay there, red once, now a bruised brown at the corners, our father's balance sheets marching across its pages, in a hand that wasted no flourishes. The first page bore the partnership's original terms in stiff blue ink, a preamble my father used to recite the way some men recite prayers. I read the lines, and then the next, and then I stopped where a marginal note lived in my brother's handwriting from 1984. "Consider revising for tax efficiency. Ask J." I had never seen that note. "Who had keys to this room when the cabinets moved?" I asked. "Only him," Lou said. "And the new office girl. Quiet one, always early." He gave her a list, real ghost of fiber along the spine, stiffer than the rest. A space where history used to be is a louder confession than any speech. The missing page would have held the codicil father drafted the summer he fell on the loading dock and decided the company should outlive his bones. I remembered the day. I had been the one to fetch him water. My brother had fetched the pen. Lou watched the color drain from my face and mistook it for fatigue. He reached for a chair. I shook my head. The millstone would need grain. Here it was, but the hole where the page had been was grain of another sort, a proof of taking, not possession. I slid the ledger back into the cloth, tied the twine with the same knot sailors use when they expect to return, and tucked it under my arm. "I don't want trouble," Lou said, cap twisting in his hands. "You already had it," I answered. "You just didn't know its name." We walked back through the aisle slowly, men escorting a witness. Outside, the sun felt brighter than it had any right to be. I saw a boy on a bicycle deliver a parcel with the speed of someone paid by the mile, and it occurred to me that my brother had been delivering something else for years, fast and unnoticed. With the weight of the ledger against my ribs, I understood whose silence would break first. It was not bravado, but a calculation, the kind that keeps a man alive in negotiations where smiles are just sharper knives. The street hummed with the heat's slow pulse, and each step toward the subway felt like moving through layers of an old photograph, past decades pressing in from every side. I decided not to go home. Home was a place where memories could be overheard, and I wanted my thoughts to be mine alone for a few more hours. Instead, I rode to Midtown, stepping off near the old municipal building where records slept in steel cabinets taller than a man. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of brass polish and paper dust. The clerk at the counter had eyes like cloudy glass, the kind that sees too much without focusing on any one thing. I asked for the incorporation files from the year of our founding, plus amendments for the past 20 years. She tapped the request into her terminal with the slow authority of someone whose time was more valuable than yours, then vanished into the archive. While I waited, I let my gaze rest on the tiled floor. Patterns rose from it, cross-hatched squares worn smooth at the center from decades of shoes, a map of all the feet that had carried burdens through this building. Somewhere in that pattern, I thought, was my brother's tread, careful, deliberate, maybe even proud. The clerk returned with 3 gray boxes bound in cloth straps. At a table beneath a flickering bulb, I untied them. The first held our charter, the original signatures crisp as if the ink had dried yesterday. The second contained renewals, corrections, and one curious affidavit, notarized 3 years ago in a hand I didn't recognize. It referenced special consideration under Section 14B, language obscure enough to hide anything. That was when I noticed the notary's name. It wasn't the same as on the forged transfer, but the surname matched. A cousin, perhaps, or a spouse. I flipped the page, and there it was. An attached memorandum bearing my brother's signature, genuine this time, alongside the office girl's. The memo authorized streamlined restructuring of certain asset allocations contingent on board approval. But there was no board signature, only his. A door closed without sound is still a door closed. The third box was thinner. Inside was a single envelope, heavier than it looked. I opened it to find a photostat of a lease agreement for a warehouse across the river, dated 2 weeks before the cabinets at our main site had been removed for preservation. The lessee was a shell company with a name that meant nothing to most, but made my gut tighten. Fenlock Holdings. That name had once surfaced in a whispered conversation between our father and an alderman, the sort of talk where words are chosen like weapons. I was not holding coincidence. I was holding a map. The minor twist came when I turned over the lease and found, scribbled in pencil, the initials RL and a date. Next Tuesday. My brother's first name was Robert. He had always used a fountain pen. The pencil was not his. I returned the boxes and walked out into the heat. The sky above City Hall was the color of old linen, clouds pressed flat. I thought about that penciled note. Someone else knew. Someone else was either helping him or waiting for him to stumble. In a way, this was worse than simple theft. It meant the circle was wider. And wider circles have more shadows. I made my way to the river, the ledger still firm under my arm. The water below was sluggish, reflecting light in broken shards. Barges moved like silent witnesses. Across the span, I could almost see the line of warehouses, one of which held our missing history. It occurred to me then that the silence I was counting on breaking might not be his at all. And if it wasn't, I would need to know whose voice I was about to hear. The sentence felt like a key in my mouth as I followed the river north, keeping to the shade where the brick held last night's cool. I cut back inland and climbed the steps to a diner that had kept the same counter since the Eisenhower years, chrome bright enough to see a man's lies in. The bell above the door rang once. In a corner booth sat the office girl, hair pinned plain, cardigan, even in the heat, hands folded as if she had been taught to wait without. The syllables did not land at once. Lee is a common enough name in this city, but not when paired with the family nose and that careful way of watching. She was my brother's daughter, and she had not trusted me enough to say so until now. We ordered coffee we did not want. The waitress poured as if refilling a wound. Ruth's fingers worried the edge of a napkin until lint gathered like snow. "You're being set up for the blame," she said, low, precise. "There's a meeting next Tuesday across the river. He'll bring the old papers, altered, to prove you consented to the transfer. Fenlock pays him off, then locks you out with a court order already drafted." Her diction was my brother's, each word ironed. I felt the old ache in my chest that had nothing to do with age. "Why tell me?" "Because the first lie wasn't his," she said, and the napkin finally tore. That was when I realized the handwriting on the missing page had been our father's all along. She slid a narrow envelope across the table. Inside, folded small and thin with a woman's patience, lay a strip of paper torn from the ledger's spine, the same fiber teeth I had felt with my fingertips in the warehouse. On it, in Father's uncompromising hand, was a clause I had not seen since the summer he fell. In the event that Jonathan Lee withdraws from daily operation for a period exceeding 6 consecutive months, full voting authority may be vested in Robert Lee for the purpose of preserving continuity. It was attested, notarized, dated the month my wife's lungs failed and I slept in hospital chairs, shaving in the men's room with a dull blade. The room narrowed to the rectangle of paper. Father had not intended theft, he had intended survival. But tools don't choose the hands that use them. My brother had kept the clause quiet, then learned how to stretch continuity until it covered everything from shipping schedules to soul. "He told me to file copies and move the cabinets," Ruth said. "He said mold. I smelled camphor. I made one pencil note he wouldn't see. The initials stand for what I couldn't say out loud." "Ruth Lee," I said, giving the letters back to her, anchoring them. She nodded. "If this goes to court without that strip, you lose in the first hour." She paused. "If it goes with it, he loses face in a way he can't afford." The waitress returned to ask if we wanted pie. No one eats pie in the middle of a confession. We both shook our heads. I looked at Ruth and saw a ledger line that had never been drawn, an heir who knew where every cost would land. There is a particular cruelty to discovering your father built the door your brother used to walk into your house. And yet there was— "I'll need your testimony," I said. "You'll have it," she answered, not bravely, but correctly. We left separately. Outside, the street heat moved in slow tides. I tucked the strip beside the ledger and felt the shape of our father's hand settling under my palm. Across the avenue, a boy chased a paper bag the wind tried to claim, and for an instant I envied him his simple war. I started downtown toward the courthouse, the envelope riding light as a fuse against my ribs. Whatever voice I had been waiting to hear had spoken, and it carried our name with a steadiness I had nearly forgotten. But steadiness would not be enough. Not when Tuesday waited across the river with its own kind of grammar, and not when blood had already learned how to lie. That sentence stayed with me as I crossed Foley Square, where the granite steps were worn to the curve of 1,000 arguments. Above, the courthouse columns stood like men who had learned to listen without ever having to answer. I didn't go inside, not yet. The law could wait. I needed to measure the ground between now and Tuesday, and to see the faces that might be standing on it. There's a difference between evidence and advantage. One gets you in the room, the other keeps you there. I took the subway to Brooklyn, where Fenlock Holdings' warehouse sat by a stretch of river the tourists never photographed. The air smelled of tar and rusted chains, the kind of scent that makes you think of promises kept only in the dark. From across the street, I could see the loading dock door half open, a rectangle of shadow where men moved like shapes cut from thicker paper. One of them was my brother. He was leaning against a stack of crates, cigarette lit, talking to a man in a pale suit whose shoes had never known dust. Even from here, I could tell my brother was in performance mode, slouched enough to seem casual, eyes narrowed enough to seem shrewd. The pale-suited man laughed once, short and clipped, the laugh of someone who liked winning more than jokes. I stayed in the doorway of an abandoned print shop until they went inside. Then I crossed to the side alley, where a service door was propped open with a broken cinder block. The corridor beyond was cool and smelled faintly of varnish. I walked slow, listening for the rise and fall of voices, catching fragments about finalizing terms and ensuring the paperwork matches the narrative. That was when I realized my brother's theft was no longer just about the business. It was about rewriting the family's history to make me the villain. I slipped back out before the echo of my footsteps could betray me. Across the street, a man in a leather apron was hosing down the sidewalk in front of a metal shop. I asked him, casual as weather talk, how long Fenlock had been in that building. "Couple years," he said. "Don't see much action till the suits show up. Then it's a parade, black cars, no plates." Information was trickling in, but I needed a flood. Back in Manhattan, I visited an old acquaintance, Martha Raines, a retired court reporter who had once kept the minutes in our board's more contentious meetings. She lived in a rent-controlled apartment lined with file cabinets instead of bookshelves. Martha had the gift of remembering not just what was said, but how it was said. When I told her about Tuesday, she disappeared into her cabinets and returned with a transcript from 8 years ago, a meeting where my brother had floated the idea of streamlining authority. The language was eerily similar to the memo Ruth had shown me. She tapped a line in the transcript. Provisional control should be framed as a necessity, not a preference. My brother had planted the seed long before I noticed the tree. By the time I left Martha's, the daylight had thinned to copper. I stopped at a bench overlooking the river, the same river I'd been circling for days, as if its current could carry answers. In my lap lay the ledger, the strip from Ruth, and now the transcript. 3 pieces of a puzzle whose full picture would ruin a man's name. But names are like ships. They can sink slow, taking years, or they can capsize in an instant if the weight shifts just right. Tuesday would be that shift. I could feel it. The trick would be making sure the river ran only one way, and for that, I would need someone on the inside when the door closed. The sentence lingered like the aftertaste of bitter coffee as I stepped back into the city's evening currents. New York after dark doesn't get quieter. It just trades its noise for whispers, and I knew exactly where to find them. I went to Mott Street, to a small back room above a herbal shop where the air smelled of dried roots and lacquer. The man who greeted me, Henry Yip, had once run freight for us under a different name. He was the kind of man who could walk through locked gates without touching the latch. His loyalty was for sale, but his memory was not. He poured tea without asking why I'd come. I told him about Tuesday, about the warehouse across the river, and about the men who would be in the room. His eyes didn't move from mine, but his fingers tapped twice against the porcelain cup. In Henry's language, that meant yes, but at a price. "What do you want?" I asked. "A guarantee," he said, "not from you, from the record." He wanted his name erased from certain manifests in our older files, papers that tied him to shipments he'd rather not have the law revisit. It wasn't hard to arrange, not with the ledger in my possession. I told him he'd have it before Tuesday morning. His answer was a nod so slight it could have been a muscle twitch. With Henry, I had my eyes and ears inside, but I also had a question gnawing at me: how far my brother had gone to seal this play. That was when Henry mentioned something I didn't expect. The pay was no stranger to our family. He had once been a silent investor in my father's first expansion, an expansion that had nearly bankrupted us until my mother mortgaged the brownstone to keep the business afloat. The man's name was Gordon Price, and he had vanished from our dealings decades ago, rumored to have moved into shadowy real estate trades overseas. If Price was back, it meant my brother was dealing in more than family assets. I left Mott Street with the weight of that name settling alongside the ledger and the strip from Ruth. A triangle had formed: my brother, Price, and Fenlock, and I was standing outside it with a match in my hand. Midway down Canal, I ducked into a phone booth and called Ruth from a number she wouldn't recognize. I told her Henry would be in the room on Tuesday and that she should treat him like a ghost, seen but never acknowledged. Her voice was steady, but I caught the quick inhale before she said, "Understood." Back in my apartment, I laid everything on the table: the ledger, the strip, the transcript from Martha, Henry's conditions scrawled on a scrap of receipt paper. The city outside sounded like a jury murmuring behind closed doors. I thought of Price's laugh in the warehouse, sharp and final. Men like him didn't sit at tables without owning them first. The minor twist came when I opened the ledger again and noticed something I'd missed. Faint indentations on the page after the torn one, the kind left by a pen pressing through thin paper. I shaded over it lightly with a pencil and saw the outline of numbers. Large sums, each beside an initial P. My father's hand again. Price's money had been in our books once before, and it had almost destroyed us. My brother hadn't just invited him back. He'd handed him the keys. The city clock struck 10. I closed the ledger and stared at the map of Tuesday in my head. The warehouse, the players, the paper. The only unknown was how much of the past would come crawling into that room when the door closed. And now I knew I would have to be the one to open it first. The thought had the weight of iron and the edge of glass, sharp enough to cut without a sound. The night outside my window was dense, the kind of black that doesn't reflect, and I found myself pacing its narrow corridors like a man in his own courtroom. I didn't sleep. Instead, I pulled the ledger close and read it again, tracing every loop and slant of my father's handwriting, every gap my brother had turned into a foothold. The faint smell of camphor clung to it, as if the paper remembered the cabinets it had been hidden in. At dawn, I walked to the pier. The river air was brackish and cold, an old smell that belonged to mornings before my hair had turned white. I needed the quiet here. It was the only place the city's noise was swallowed before it reached the ear. My thoughts ran through Tuesday's possibilities, doors opening, hands shaking, ink drying, but it was the moment after the ink that mattered most. That was when I realized the real fight would not be over what my brother had taken, but over what would be believed. Back in my apartment, I drafted a sequence. Henry would position himself near the back wall, close enough to hear everything without drawing attention. Ruth would carry the strip of paper in her bag, sealed in an envelope marked with nothing but a date. I would arrive late enough to make them wait, but early enough to see the lay of the table before the first word was spoken. There was one last piece missing: leverage on Price. I had no illusions about bringing my brother to heel without also making Price step back. Men like him don't retreat unless the ground beneath them starts to crack. By noon, I was in a taxi to the Upper East Side, where Price kept an office in a limestone building that smelled of money too old to count. I didn't go inside, I watched. For 3 hours, men in suits came and went, none staying longer than a cigarette's length. At last, Price emerged, stepping into a chauffeured car. I followed in another taxi, trailing him to a townhouse 2 blocks away. The driver let him out and he vanished inside. I waited. Half an hour later, a different man left, a broker I knew by sight from an old shipping insurance dispute. If Price was meeting him now, it meant he was moving assets. That was something a judge could be made to notice, especially if it happened before Tuesday. The minor twist came when I saw the broker hand an envelope to a woman stepping out of a florist shop across the street. She wasn't anyone I recognized until she turned her head and I caught the line of her jaw. It was the same as Ruth's. I stayed put, watching her walk away, the envelope tucked under her arm. Blood ran in more directions than I'd thought. If she was family, she was also a conduit, and I needed to know for whom she carried messages. Evening settled in. I walked home under a sky streaked with steel blue, the ledger under my arm like a second spine. Tomorrow would be the last quiet day before the meeting. I would use it to tie every loose thread, no matter whose neck it looped around. Inside, I laid the ledger flat, the strip from Ruth beside it, the transcript from Martha folded on top. 3 truths, waiting. The trick would be choosing the one to show first. And as I sat there in the dim light, I understood that opening the door on Tuesday would mean closing another one forever, one with my brother's name carved into it, and my father's hand behind the carving. The image followed me into the next morning, clinging like the smell of coal smoke that used to drift through the warehouse windows in winter. It was the day before Tuesday, and the city felt as if it had been holding its breath for me. Both required precision. First, I needed to know who the woman outside the florist had been delivering that envelope to. If she was blood, she was a complication. If she was hired, she was a vulnerability. I traced her route from memory, cutting through side streets until I reached a row of tenements near the river. The curtains in her second-floor window were drawn, but the scent of cut flowers drifted down the stairwell, mixed with something sharper, ink, maybe, or polish from a well-used desk. I didn't knock. Instead, I waited across the street at a newsstand, thumbing through papers I didn't read. It was nearly an hour before she appeared, dressed plain but walking with a purpose. I followed her 2 blocks to a small law office, one of those quiet firms that handled wills, trusts, and the kind of documents people didn't like to talk about. She went inside and stayed. That was when I realized Price wasn't just moving assets. He was preparing for a transition. My brother's scheme was only the opening act. From there, my second errand took me back to Henry. We met in a tea house this time, where the steam fogged the windows, and the noise of the street outside faded to a hum. I told him about the woman, about the law office, about Price. Henry didn't blink. If she's carrying paper for him, he said, it means the deal's already signed in their heads. You need to make them doubt their own ink. How? I asked. Show them a page they forgot existed. His words made me think of the ledger again, and the faint indentations I had shaded to reveal those payments to P. If I presented that in the right way, Price would see not just the risk of exposure, but the risk of losing his control over my brother. Men like him hated a shaky partner more than an enemy. The minor twist came when Henry leaned in and told me he'd overheard something in the warehouse last night. Ruth's name. My brother had mentioned her, but not in anger, in admiration. She's sharper than he thinks, Henry said. Maybe he means to bring her in after you're gone. That thought unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. If Ruth crossed the line, even for survival, the case I was building would crumble. We parted with no more words than needed. Back at my apartment, I laid out the plan again, this time with contingencies. If Ruth wavered, I'd need a second witness. Martha could do it, but her connection was older, weaker in the eyes of a court. Still, it was better than walking in alone. Evening came early, clouds rolling in low over the river. I stood at the window, watching the city's lights blink into place one by one, as if each was a signal meant only for someone who knew the code. Tomorrow, the room across the river would close its door, and the voices inside would decide whose story would outlive the other. I closed the curtains and let the darkness settle around the table where the ledger lay open, the strip from Ruth folded neatly on top. Somewhere in the city, my brother was rehearsing his lines, but tomorrow, he wouldn't be the only one with a script. I woke before dawn, the city still in its gray prelude, and the thought was already there, solid, cold, and waiting. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the day had been built to bear more weight than most. I dressed deliberately, choosing the dark suit I wore to our father's funeral, the one that still carried the faintest scent of cedar from years in storage. The ledger slid into my briefcase with a sound like a door closing. The strip from Ruth went into my breast pocket, close enough to feel against my ribs. I left the transcript from Martha on the table. It would only come into play if I needed to crush the whole structure. Outside, the streets were wet from a night rain, and reflections in the pavement made the world look doubled. Two cities, one real and one imagined, walking side by side. The taxi driver didn't speak. That suited me. I needed the quiet. We crossed the bridge toward the warehouse. The river beneath was sluggish, moving as if it too knew the weight of what was about to happen. I could see the building from a block away, its brick walls dark with age, the dock doors already open. Henry's shadow appeared in a side window, exactly where I'd told him to be. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of sawdust and metal. My brother stood at the far end of a long table, Price beside him, both looking up as I entered. There were no handshakes, only the scrape of a chair as I sat opposite them. "That was when I realized," I said, setting the ledger down between us. "This isn't about business anymore. It's about rewriting history." Price's expression didn't change, but my brother's eyes narrowed a fraction. "You're late," he said. "I wanted to be sure I brought the right book," I replied. Ruth came in then, carrying a slim folder. She took a seat near the wall, not looking at me, not looking at her father. Henry shifted slightly, just enough to signal he could hear everything. Price opened the meeting with a bland summary of the terms, speaking as though I had already agreed to them. My brother followed with a speech about stability, continuity, the legacy of the Lee name. Every word was designed to sound like an act of mercy. That was when I slid the ledger toward them, open to the page after the torn one, the shaded indentations of payments to P. Price's gaze flicked to my face, then back to the page. He didn't touch it. "I found this last week," I said, voice even. "Curious, isn't it, how some debts repeat themselves?" The room tightened. My brother glanced at Price, looking for the signal to continue, but none came. Price leaned back, silent, and I knew the ground had shifted. "Reveal the strip with Father's clause. It shows exactly when and why authority could pass, and it's dated in a month when Jonathan was at the hospital, not in the office, which means any action taken beyond that period without his consent was void." The sound of her voice in that room was sharper than any gavel. Price stood, buttoning his jacket. "Gentlemen, I think we should reconvene after reviewing these materials." His tone was pure withdrawal. He left without shaking hands. My brother stayed seated, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the strip of paper. The silence between us was not the silence of negotiation. It was the silence after a verdict. I closed the ledger, slid it back into my briefcase, and stood. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice low. "No," I answered. "It's just moving to a different room." The words left my mouth like a marker laid on a map, claiming territory no one had thought to contest. Outside, the river wind carried the tang of iron and wet stone. I let it fill my lungs before stepping off the dock, because I knew the air in the next room would be heavier. Henry followed me out, keeping pace without speaking. When we reached the corner, he finally said, "Price won't come back. He's not a man who plays with variables he didn't design." I nodded, but I didn't slow my steps. Price's absence was good for leverage, bad for certainty. Because a man like that always has another move waiting in the dark. I hailed a cab and told Henry I'd be in touch. My mind wasn't on him anymore. It was on Ruth. She had spoken in that room like someone unafraid to lose her footing, but the way she avoided my eyes told me there was more behind it. The strip of paper she had shown had stopped my brother cold. But I kept thinking about the envelope I'd seen her carry from the florist to the law office.
A person carrying two different messages might also be carrying two different loyalties. Back at my apartment, I laid the ledger on the table and stared at it without opening it. The day had been a victory of sorts, but victory is a dangerous thing. It makes you think the ground under you is solid. I'd lived long enough to know it never is. That was when I realized I'd been thinking about my brother in the wrong tense. He wasn't planning to fight in court alone. He was planning to change the battlefield entirely. Evening was settling in when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was Martha's. "Jonathan," she said, "someone's been asking about transcripts from the year your father died." I sat forward. "Who?" "They didn't give a name," she replied. "But they described a woman, late 20s, dark hair, glasses. Sounds like the girl you brought up before." It was Ruth. The minor twist hit like cold water. Whatever she had done for me in that room today, she was still moving on another track. If she had those transcripts, she might be
holding a card even I didn't know about. And if my brother got to her first, she could become the linchpin in his next play. I thanked Martha, hung up, and stared out the window. The streetlights were halos in the mist, the kind that made faces look softer than they were. Somewhere out there, Ruth was choosing her next step, and the direction she chose would tell me whether she was an ally or just another opponent wearing my bloodline. I poured a drink I didn't finish and pulled out a legal pad. The plan for the next day wasn't about Price or even my brother. It was about finding Ruth before either of them did. I would start at the law office, then the florist, then anywhere else her routine might lead. I had until sunset to get her to speak plainly, because after that, the city would swallow her in its own noise. The rain started again, light at first, then steady, the kind that polished the streets until every reflection seemed like an open door. I closed the curtains, but the sound stayed with me, ticking against the glass like a slow verdict. Tomorrow, the game would shift again, and this time, the room it moved to might not have a door I could open. The sentence kept me awake, pacing my apartment long past midnight. The city outside had gone to its softer sounds, garbage trucks groaning down the avenues, the far-off wail of a siren climbing and falling like a fever, but none of it masked the ticking in my head. I rose before the sun and dressed for movement, not meetings. A dark overcoat, flat cap, and the soft-soled shoes I'd once worn on warehouse floors when I needed to hear others without being heard myself. The ledger stayed behind. It had already done its part. Today was about people, not paper. The law office was my first stop. The receptionist's smile was trained but thin, the kind that said she was paid more to guard than to welcome. I asked for Ruth by name, pretending to be an uncle in town unexpectedly. The receptionist's hesitation told me she'd heard the name but wouldn't admit it. That kind of pause always meant there was someone in the back who didn't want to be disturbed. I left without pressing further. Better to make her believe she'd kept her secret. Around the corner, I waited by a cigarette stand. It was less than 20 minutes before Ruth stepped out, coat buttoned tight, a thin folder under her arm. She didn't look behind her. I followed from a distance, watching her cut across streets like she knew exactly where she was going. She stopped briefly at the florist, exchanged a small envelope with the same woman I'd seen before, then moved on toward the subway. That was when I realized she was delivering the same way Price's couriers had moved in the old days, small steps in a larger chain. I caught her just before she descended the stairs. "Ruth," I said, enough weight in my voice to make her turn. Her face flickered through surprise, calculation, then something like resignation. "We can't talk here," she murmured, already walking toward a quieter side street. We found a bench beneath a bare-limbed tree. The wind carried the smell of the river even this far inland. She didn't sit right away, just stood with the folder clutched against her chest. "You're not the only one watching me," she said. "If I speak to you too long, I'll lose what little protection I have." "Protection from who?" "Not your brother," she said, finally sitting. "From Price. He has someone in the law office. If I don't deliver what they hand me, they'll assume I've switched sides." The minor twist came when she opened the folder, just enough for me to see the top page, a copy of one of Father's original board directives, the ink faded but the seal intact. It wasn't a duplicate from the archive, it was an original. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "From the same cabinet the ledger came out of," she said. "I kept it back then because I thought it might matter someday. Now I'm supposed to deliver it to Price as proof that the continuity clause was meant to be permanent. He'll use it to argue your father intended Robert to keep control." I exhaled slowly, the air turning white in the morning chill. If that document reached Price, the fight in court would twist into something far more dangerous: intent over action, interpretation over fact. "You need to give it to me instead," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once quickly, like a swimmer deciding to dive. "Meet me tonight, after they've seen me deliver an empty folder. But if I do this, you finish it. No more rooms, no more moving pieces." Her voice was calm, but I could see the strain in her hands. We stood and parted without another word, walking in opposite directions. The day was already tilting toward its next room, and I couldn't be sure the door there would stay open long enough for me to step through. That thought followed me down to the river that evening, where the water carried the city's light in long, broken strokes. Every gust off the current felt colder than it should have been for that time of year, as if the wind itself knew what was coming. I kept my back to the street, watching the pier where Ruth had agreed to meet me. The clock on the ferry terminal glowed against the dark, each minute drawing out longer than it should. At last, I saw her approach, coat collar up, empty folder in hand, walking with the deliberate pace of someone making sure to be seen. She joined me without greeting, setting the folder on the bench between us. "They watched me hand this to a courier an hour ago," she said. "That one's empty. The real one," she reached into her coat, "is here." The folder she passed me was heavier. I slid it open just enough to see the worn edges of the original directive, the paper's texture rougher than any copy could mimic. Seal was intact, my father's seal. That was when I realized this wasn't just a document. It was the last unbroken bridge between his intent and my brother's betrayal. "You understand what happens if this goes public?" I asked. She nodded. "It won't just be him who falls. Price will burn it all down rather than be dragged into the open. You'll have nothing left but the name." I thought of the ledger, of the strip, of the years spent keeping that name upright even when the weight of it threatened to crack my own spine. And I thought of what it might mean to watch it sink if that was the only way to stop him. The street lamps along the pier buzzed faintly. Somewhere far off, a ship's horn bled into the night. Ruth leaned closer, voice low. "He knows I've been talking to you. He hasn't confronted me, but he's changed the way he looks at me. If you're going to act, it has to be now, before he makes his own move." The minor twist came when she pulled a small notepad from her pocket and tore off a page. On it was a list of names. 3 I didn't recognize, 1 I did. Henry's. "I don't know what this means," she said. "I found it in a drawer in Price's office when he stepped out. But it's in your brother's handwriting." I stared at Henry's name. It wasn't possible, not after everything, but the ink was his, the slant of the letters exact. If Henry was feeding my brother information, then every step I'd taken might already be known on the other side. I folded the list into my palm and told Ruth to go home by a different route, to wait for my call. She didn't argue. After she left, I stayed on the bench, watching the ferry lights drift across the water. The folder lay heavy in my lap. I had the piece that could end my brother in court, but I also had a name that could split my own side apart before we got there. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of oil from upriver, and I understood the choice had been made for me. Tomorrow I would have to decide not just which door to open, but which ally to shut out before the next room even saw their face. The weight of that choice followed me back through the streets where the puddles from the earlier rain reflected shop fronts like false windows. Every step felt like it was carrying 2 different verdicts, one for my brother and one for whoever had decided Henry's loyalty was a currency they could buy. Sleep didn't come. I sat in the armchair with the folder from Ruth balanced on my knees, the list of names folded tight in my pocket. The city moved beyond the glass in slow, heavy strokes, as if even its lights had grown cautious. I kept seeing Henry's face in that side window of the warehouse, the nod he gave when I told him the plan. Was it cover, Or had my brother planted the page for me to find, knowing exactly how it would erode my trust? By sunrise, my decision was half made. I couldn't walk into the final confrontation with a man at my side whose loyalty I had to measure with every breath. I went to the tea house before it opened, slipping inside as the owner rolled up the gate. Henry arrived minutes later, looking surprised to see me already seated. "We're not going to Tuesday together," I said before he could speak. He frowned. "Why?" I placed the folded page on the table between us, smoothing it flat. His eyes went to his name, then to mine. The silence that followed wasn't defensive, it was too measured for that. "That's not my hand," he said. "But it's meant for you to think it is. Your brother knows what doubt does to a man like you." It was a clean answer, too clean, and that was when I realized the truth didn't matter anymore, only what I could afford to risk. "I can't take you inside," I said. "If you're with me, I need to know there's no shadow in the corner of my eye." Henry didn't argue. He just stood, nodded once, and left without touching the paper. That was his way of saying the bridge between us had burned whether I'd lit it or not. The minor twist came when, as he walked out, I saw the reflection of someone watching us from across the street. Ruth. She didn't approach. She didn't need to. Her presence meant she'd wanted to see whether I'd cut Henry loose, and now she knew. By mid-morning, the air over the river had turned sharp, the kind that stung the lungs and made every breath feel deliberate. I took a long walk along the piers, the folder from Ruth under my arm, and thought about the doors I had left. The courtroom was one, but so was the quieter door of negotiation, a closed-room settlement that would keep our name intact, but leave my brother untouched by public shame. I hated the thought of it, but the document in my possession was powerful enough to force that choice onto the table. As the afternoon light began to thin, I stopped at the courthouse steps and stood there without climbing them. Inside was the promise of process, slow, deliberate, and merciless. Across the river in the warehouse was the promise of speed, danger, and a kind of finality the law could never deliver. When I turned away from the courthouse, I knew I was choosing the river. Tomorrow, the meeting would not wait for a judge or a clerk. It would be my brother, the paper, and whatever pieces of our father's name we could still carry without letting them sink us both. The words circled me all night, threading through the sound of the river outside my window. I didn't lie in bed. I sat at the table, the folder in front of me, the seal on the directive catching the dim light like an unblinking eye. Dawn came pale and cold. I dressed simply, dark coat, no tie, gloves in the pocket. This wasn't a day for showing power. It was a day for keeping it close to the chest. Memories. The warehouse loomed ahead sooner than I expected. Its brick walls held the cold, and the smell of oil drifted from the open dock. Inside, my brother stood near the far wall, a small table between us. He looked older than he had the last time I saw him. Lines deeper, eyes sharper. "You came alone," he said. "So did you." We didn't shake hands. I placed the folder on the table. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he studied my face, searching for some crack in the expression I'd been wearing since Father died. "That paper could burn us both," he said finally. "It could," I agreed. "Or it could settle this without either of us dragging the family name through court." That was when I realized he wasn't afraid of losing the business. He was afraid of losing the version of our father he'd built in his mind, the one that justified every move he'd made. "I never wanted to ruin you," he said, voice low. "I wanted to keep what was ours. You stepped away, and I stepped in." I leaned forward. You didn't step in. You stepped over me. There's a difference. The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. He glanced at the folder again. What do you want? Full return of control. You keep your share, but you step back, and Price disappears. The minor twist came when he gave a small, dry laugh. Price is already gone. He knew Ruth was playing both sides. She told him she'd stay with me, but she passed you that paper. He saw the crack and walked. I didn't let him see the relief. If Price was gone, then the danger had shifted entirely to this table. He reached for the folder at last, opened it, and stared at the directive. His thumb brushed the seal. Father would have hated this, he murmured. Father hated wasted time, I said. Decide. He closed the folder, slid it back across the table, and nodded once. It's yours, but don't think this makes us even. I never did. We left through different doors. Outside, the mist had lifted slightly, the river showing in broken flashes between buildings. I walked without hurry, the folder under my arm, the sound of his last words still in my ears. This was resolution of a kind, but not peace. You can reclaim a business, a name, a ledger full of numbers, but you can't rebuild the trust that was stripped from you one forged page at a time. By the time I reached the bridge, the city was fully awake. Barges moved slow upriver, their hulls dark against the lightening sky. Somewhere behind me,